places where she felt this subtle yet unmistakable reminder of her place. She sighed inwardly, brushing the thoughts aside. Stay focused, she told herself. The law doesn't wait for feelings. The flight attendant stopped abruptly at her row, looking down at Amara with a tightly controlled smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Excuse me, ma'am," the woman said, her tone overly polite in a way that felt anything but friendly. "I need to check your seat assignment." Amara raised an eyebrow. "Is there a problem?" "Just a routine check," the flight attendant replied, though her body language told a different story. Amara could sense the tension in the way the woman stood, hands clasped a little too tightly. Keeping her expression neutral, Amara retrieved her boarding pass from her clutch and handed it over. The attendant scanned it, her eyes narrowing slightly, before nodding and handing it back. "Everything seems to be in order," the attendant said, her voice clipped. "Of course it is," Amara replied evenly, holding the woman's gaze for a beat longer than necessary. The attendant hesitated, as if debating whether to say more, but then moved on, her heels clicking sharply against the cabin floor. Amara watched her go, feeling the faint stirrings of anger bubbling beneath her composed exterior. She turned back to her tablet, willing herself to focus. The flight continued without incident until the meal service began. The same flight attendant returned, this time balancing a tray of food. Amara accepted it with a polite thank you, determined not to let the earlier encounter rattle her further. But as the woman leaned forward to set the tray down, her elbow brushed against Amara's shoulder, causing a splash of sauce to spill onto the pristine fabric of her dress. "Oh no," the attendant exclaimed, feigning surprise. "I'm so sorry." Amara looked down at the stain spreading across the expensive fabric, her heart sinking. She dabbed at it with a napkin, but the rich color of the sauce had already set in. "It's fine," Amara said tightly, though her patience was wearing thin. The attendant reached forward as if to help, but instead tugged at the fabric of the dress, the force causing a distinct ripping sound. Amara froze, her sharp intake of breath the only sound in the now quiet cabin. The attendant's face turned pale as she stared at the tear she'd just caused. I didn't mean to." "Of course you didn't," Amara said, her tone icy. She stood, her imposing height and commanding presence suddenly filling the narrow aisle. The calm, composed demeanor she carried so effortlessly in the courtroom now had a razor-sharp edge. The murmurs of nearby passengers grew louder as they watched the scene unfold. Amara's voice, though steady, cut through the noise like a gavel striking wood. "I would like to speak to your supervisor, and now—" The attendant stammered, her earlier bravado crumbling under Amara's unyielding gaze. Within moments, the head flight attendant arrived, her expression a mixture of concern and confusion. Amara explained what had happened, her words measured but firm. As she spoke, she caught sight of a few passengers nodding in quiet agreement, their earlier curiosity giving way to subtle solidarity. "I expect this matter to be addressed appropriately," Amara finished, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being heard. The head attendant apologized profusely, promising to file a report and ensure Amara's dress was replaced, but Amara wasn't done. "And one more thing," she added, her eyes locking on to the flight attendant who had caused the incident. "I suggest you think carefully about how you treat people. You never know who you might be dealing with." With that, she returned to her seat, the cabin falling into a hushed silence. She smoothed down what was left of her dress and opened her case files once more. For Amara Hayes, the case at hand was far from over, but this particular trial she had already won. From anger, but from the steady, calculated resolve that had carried her through so many moments like this, she met Carol's gaze, her expression calm but unyielding. "I'm a Supreme Court justice," Amara said, her voice even, each word deliberate. The businessman across the aisle visibly reacted, his eyes widening in surprise, while the elderly gentleman who had nodded earlier now watched the exchange with keen interest. Carol's lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. The color drained slightly from her face as she quickly handed the boarding pass back. I see," she stammered, her earlier confidence faltering. Amara took the pass without breaking eye contact. "Is there anything else you need to verify?" she asked, her tone measured but carrying the weight of someone who would not be trifled with. "No," Carol replied, stepping back and fumbling with her cart. "Enjoy your meal." "Thank you," Amara said, her composure intact. She returned to her seat, placing the boarding pass back into her purse with deliberate care. As the tension slowly dissipated, Amara noticed the businessman giving her an approving nod before returning to his laptop. The elderly gentleman across the aisle smiled faintly, tipping his head in quiet recognition. Amara allowed herself a small exhale, her focus shifting back to the case file on her tablet. She had more important battles to fight than the microaggressions of a narrow-minded flight attendant. Still, she couldn't help but think of her mother's words again, echoing in her mind. "They can only make you feel small if you let them." This was just another moment, another test of the dignity and grace she had spent a lifetime mastering, and as always, she had risen above it. As the flight entered its cruising phase, casting soft shadows over the tense aftermath of the exchange, Amara folded the tissues neatly, setting them aside, and adjusted her posture, a subtle act of reclaiming her space. The businessman beside her leaned slightly closer, his voice low and empathetic. "Unbelievable behavior. I'm sorry you had to deal with that." Amara gave him a polite nod. "Thank you," she replied, her tone measured but not dismissive. She didn't need an ally to validate her feelings, but the gesture was appreciated nonetheless. She returned to her case file, her fingers scrolling through pages of legal arguments and testimony summaries. The words offered a familiar anchor, pulling her focus away from the lingering discomfort. Her work had always been her refuge, a testament to what she'd achieved despite moments like this. The older woman across the aisle watched her with quiet admiration before speaking softly. "You handled that beautifully, my dear. Don't let her ruin your flight." Amara turned to her, offering a small, genuine smile. "Thank you. I've had plenty of practice." The woman nodded knowingly, her expression one of shared understanding. Amara returned to her work, letting the rhythmic hum of the engines fill the silence. By the time the cabin lights dimmed further and the hum of conversation softened, Amara had found her rhythm again. The case before her, involving a complex environmental dispute, demanded her full attention. She immersed herself in the details, the familiar structure of legal reasoning soothing the frayed edges of her patience. But even as she worked, a thought lingered in the back of her mind. Moments like these, as infuriating as they were, reminded her why she fought so hard in her role. Her position wasn't just a personal achievement. It was a symbol, a beacon for those who might face the same battles without the armor of power or influence. When the flight finally landed, Amara gathered her things with the quiet dignity she had maintained throughout the ordeal. As she walked toward the exit, the young woman who had been watching earlier gave her a small wave, her eyes filled with admiration. Amara paused just long enough to offer a kind smile in return before stepping off the plane, her mind already shifting back to the work ahead. The law awaited, and so did the countless people she aimed to protect through it. As the flight entered its cruising phase, casting soft shadows over the tense aftermath of the exchange, Amara folded the tissues neatly, setting them aside, and adjusted her posture, a subtle act of reclaiming her space. The businessman beside her leaned slightly closer, his voice low and empathetic. "Unbelievable behavior. I'm sorry you had to deal with that." Amara gave him a polite nod. "Thank you," she replied, her tone measured but not dismissive. She didn't need an ally to validate her feelings, but the gesture was appreciated nonetheless. She returned to her case file, her fingers scrolling through pages of legal arguments and testimony summaries. The words offered a familiar anchor, pulling her focus away from the lingering discomfort. Her work had always been her refuge, a testament to what she'd achieved despite moments like this. The older woman across the aisle watched her with quiet admiration before speaking softly. "You handled that beautifully, my dear. Don't let her ruin your flight." Amara turned to her, offering a small, genuine smile. "Thank you. I've had plenty of practice." The woman nodded knowingly, her expression one of shared understanding. Amara returned to her work, letting the rhythmic hum of the engines fill the silence. By the time the cabin lights dimmed further and the hum of conversation softened, Amara had found her rhythm again. The case before her, involving a complex environmental dispute, demanded her full attention. She immersed herself in the details, the familiar structure of legal reasoning soothing the frayed edges of her patience. But even as she worked, a thought lingered in the back of her mind. Moments like these, as infuriating as they were, reminded her why she fought so hard in her role. Her position wasn't just a personal achievement. It was a symbol, a beacon for those who might face the same battles without the armor of power or influence. When the flight finally landed, Amara gathered her things with the quiet dignity she had maintained throughout the ordeal. As she walked toward the exit, the young woman who had been watching earlier gave her a small wave, her eyes filled with admiration. Amara paused just long enough to offer a kind smile in return before stepping off the plane, her mind already shifting back to the work ahead. The law awaited, and so did the countless people she aimed to protect through it. Carol's gaze was sharp, her posture tense, as though silently asserting her authority over the space. Amara met her eyes briefly, then turned back to her work. She refused to give Carol the satisfaction of knowing she'd succeeded in unsettling her. The faint hum of the engines provided a backdrop to the quiet exchanges of the cabin. Amara tried to focus on the intricate legal arguments in front of her, but her thoughts kept circling back to the tension. Each passive-aggressive act, each glare, it all reminded her of countless moments in her life when she'd been made to feel like an outsider. She glanced at the young woman seated 2 rows ahead, still occasionally stealing glances in her direction. The woman's wide eyes and furrowed brows showed a mix of concern and uncertainty. Amara wondered if she saw in her a reflection of her own future struggles. Drawing a deep breath, Amara reached for her glass, taking a deliberate sip of water. The coolness steadied her. She let her mind drift to the courtroom, a place where her presence was unquestioned, where her intellect and authority commanded respect. Here, she reminded herself, she could carry that same composure. Another memory surfaced, this time of her niece, who had asked her not long ago how she managed to stay strong in the face of bias. Amara had responded with honesty. "You don't always feel strong, but you keep showing up. That's the strength." Carol passed by again, her eyes flitting to Amara's dress with the same thinly veiled disdain as before. But Amara didn't flinch. She sat taller, her shoulders square, her gaze steady on the document before her. The elderly woman across the aisle caught her eye once more. She gave Amara a small, encouraging nod, her face soft with understanding. It was a quiet reminder that not everyone in the world carried Carol's prejudices, that allies could be found in unexpected places. As the plane began its descent, the atmosphere shifted. The hum of conversation picked up, and passengers started gathering their belongings. Carol moved efficiently through the cabin, avoiding Amara's row this time. Amara felt a flicker of relief, though it was tinged with the recognition that this wasn't a victory. It was simply a reprieve. The elderly woman stood as the plane taxied to the gate, her movements deliberate as she leaned toward Amara. "Don't let people like her dim your light," she said softly, her voice kind but firm. Amara smiled, gratitude evident in her expression. "Thank you," she replied, her voice equally gentle. The young woman ahead lingered near the exit, waiting for Amara to disembark. When Amara reached her, she hesitated before speaking. "I just wanted to say, you're inspiring. Watching you handle that with so much grace, it gives me hope." Amara paused, touched by the words. "Thank you," she said warmly. "Never forget that your strength can inspire others too." Stepping off the plane, Amara felt the crisp airport air greet her, a welcome contrast to the stifling tension of the cabin. Her mind was already shifting to the work ahead, but she carried with her the quiet resolve that had seen her through so many moments like this one. It wasn't just about enduring, it was about continuing to stand tall, for herself and for those who looked to her as a symbol of possibility. Paused, the confidence in her demeanor faltering under the weight of Amara's gaze and the silent judgment of the passengers. "I just meant," she began, her voice losing its edge, "that first-class spaces can be restrictive." Amara's eyes didn't waver. "Restrictive," she repeated, the word hanging in the air between them. She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "I find it interesting how those restrictions seem to apply selectively." Carol flushed a deeper shade of red. The tension in the cabin was palpable, and the air felt thick with unspoken truths. The elderly woman across the aisle set her book down again, her gaze unwavering, ready to interject if needed. The young woman with the phone was no longer hiding her actions, her thumb hovering over the screen as she recorded the exchange. A faint ripple of awareness spread through the cabin. As more passengers tuned in, the quiet murmurs of conversation giving way to a shared silence of observation. Carol opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, apparently reconsidering. Finally she muttered, "I apologize if I came across poorly. That wasn't my intention." Amara held her gaze for a moment longer, her silence pressing, before she nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said, her tone measured, offering no reprieve but also not pushing further. Carol quickly moved on, her retreat marked by the hurried squeak of her shoes against the cabin floor. The businessman beside Amara stirred again, leaning closer. "Good for you," he said softly, his tone carrying a mix of approval and apology for not stepping in sooner. The elderly woman gave Amara an encouraging smile. "Well handled, my dear. Some lessons are best taught with grace." Amara exhaled slowly, letting the moment settle. She felt a mix of exhaustion and resolve. She hadn't sought this confrontation, but now that it had happened, she hoped it might leave an impression, not just on Carol, but on everyone who had witnessed it. As the plane began its descent, the cabin lights brightened slightly, and the familiar hum of preparation for landing filled the space. Amara glanced out the window, watching the ground grow closer. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. "When you stand tall, others will see the path more clearly." Amara adjusted her seatbelt, the faint mark on her dress a reminder of the journey, not just the flight, but the ongoing one that extended far beyond the plane. Not because of her inherent worth as a human being, but because of her title, her accomplishments, her ability to command authority. It was a bittersweet reminder of the distance still to go. The elderly woman across the aisle leaned over again, her expression soft with kindness. "You handled that with more grace than most would," she said quietly, her voice carrying a warmth that seemed to cut through the tension lingering in the cabin. Amara smiled faintly, appreciating the gesture but feeling the weight of the moment too deeply to fully accept it. She glanced around, taking in the faces of the other passengers, some still watching her, others pretending not to. A young boy in the row behind her peeked over the seat, his wide eyes filled with curiosity and something else, a kind of innocent admiration. The plane continued its descent, the ground drawing closer with each passing moment. Amara looked out the window, the city lights below spreading out like a vast, glittering web. She thought about her next destination, her next case, her next opportunity to stand for something greater than herself. The quiet hum of the cabin was punctuated by the occasional rustle of papers, the muted beep of a seatbelt sign, the subdued clinking of glasses as Sarah moved through the aisle, her presence a calming counterpoint to the earlier discord. Amara rested her hand on her briefcase, feeling the reassuring weight of her grandmother's photo within it. The memory of her grandmother's strength steadied her, a reminder that the fight was never just about one moment or one flight. It was about the larger journey, the small victories that added up to meaningful change. The wheels touched down with a jolt, the plane rumbling as it slowed on the runway. Amara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Around her, passengers began to stir, gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. As she stood, the businessman beside her reached out a hand. "It was an honor to share this flight with you, Justice Hayes," he said, his tone sincere. Amara shook his hand, offering him a small but genuine smile. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady. As she moved toward the exit, the young woman with the phone caught her eye again. She hesitated, then stepped forward slightly. "Justice Hayes," she said softly, "I just want you to know that was inspiring." Amara nodded, her smile widening just a fraction. "Sometimes," she said, "you just have to remind people who you are." The young woman nodded in return, her eyes shining with understanding. As Amara stepped off the plane and into the terminal, the noise and bustle of the airport engulfed her. She adjusted her briefcase and straightened her shoulders, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle into place. There was still so much work to be done. Amara offered the young woman a faint smile. Sometimes just being aware and willing to act is enough, she replied, her tone kind but firm. The choice to stand up, or even to witness and hold someone accountable, can make all the difference. The young woman nodded, her expression resolute. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for showing me how to handle it with grace." As the plane continued its descent, Amara looked around the cabin, catching the subdued but supportive glances of a few passengers. The tension that had once gripped the space was beginning to ease, replaced by a shared sense of understanding, or perhaps simply relief that the confrontation was over. The elderly woman across the aisle smiled softly at Amara. "You handled that beautifully," she said, her voice low but steady. "People like you remind us all of what dignity looks like." Amara inclined her head in acknowledgement. "And people like you remind us of the power of solidarity," she replied. The seatbelt sign dinged once more, signaling the final approach. Around her, passengers began adjusting their belongings and readying themselves for landing. Despite the routine hum of activity, Amara felt the lingering impact of the exchange in the air, as if the cabin itself carried the weight of the moment. She reached into her briefcase and touched the photograph of her grandmother, finding solace in its presence. The memory of her grandmother's unwavering resolve bolstered her, grounding her in the knowledge that strength and grace often worked hand in hand. As the plane touched down with a gentle thud, Amara felt a deep exhale escape her chest. The wheels rolled against the tarmac, the vibrations coursing through the cabin, marking the transition from sky to ground. When the plane came to a stop, Sarah returned to Amara's seat, her expression warm but tinged with regret. "Thank you for your patience," she said softly. "If there's anything the airline can do to make this right." Amara regarded her for a moment before replying, "What matters now is ensuring this doesn't happen again, to anyone." Her words were measured, her intent clear. Sarah nodded solemnly. "Understood," she said, her voice resolute. As passengers began filing out, many paused briefly to offer Amara small gestures of respect. A nod, a murmured word of thanks, or simply a look that conveyed understanding. The businessman beside her extended his hand as they prepared to leave. "It was an honor to meet you, Justice Hayes," he said. "The honor is mine," Amara replied, her voice steady, her handshake firm. As she stepped off the plane into the terminal's bright, bustling chaos, Amara felt the weight of the encounter still with her. Yet alongside it was a quiet sense of triumph, not for herself, but for the subtle shift she'd felt in that small space between sky and ground. There was a long road ahead, but she knew this was how change began, in small moments, in shared truths, and in the courage to confront what was wrong, even at 300 feet. Moved through the terminal with a mix of haste and purpose, the fume of their activity filling the air. Amara stepped aside to let the other passengers pass, observing the manager and Carol as they lingered in the background. Carol's shoulders were still hunched, her earlier bravado entirely absent. Amara took a deep breath, the weight of the encounter settling into a familiar space in her mind, a place reserved for moments that illuminated both progress and the long road ahead. The businessman from her row gave her a respectful nod as he walked by, his face etched with thought. The young woman who had recorded the incident approached hesitantly. "I'll hold on to it for now," she said, her voice steady. "But maybe I can use it to start a conversation. People need to see this." Amara smiled faintly. Conversations are where change begins, she replied. But remember, context matters. Use it wisely. The woman nodded, slipping her phone into her pocket as she blended into the crowd. Sarah, the kind flight attendant, appeared again, her expression earnest. "I just want you to know," she began softly, "that some of us are trying to make things better, even when it feels like an uphill climb." Amara placed a hand lightly on Sarah's arm. "It's people like you who make the climb worthwhile," she said. "Keep pushing even when it feels like no one's watching." The airline manager approached cautiously, his professional mask cracking under the weight of the moment. "Justice Hayes, if there's anything else—" Amara shook her head. "What I want is for this not to happen again. Not just for me, but for anyone. The change has to start somewhere." As she turned toward the exit, the murmur of the terminal faded into the background. Outside the glass walls, the city stretched out before her, vibrant and chaotic. It reminded her of the world she'd spent her life navigating, a world where victories were often quiet, incremental, and bittersweet. This was one of those moments, not a triumph, but a step forward, small, significant, and necessary. Amara straightened her shoulders and walked on, ready for whatever came next. Rushing to connections, families reuniting, business people hurrying to meetings, Amara felt herself slipping back into her familiar role, her professional armor settling back into place. The elderly woman from the flight appeared one last time, touching Amara's arm. "You've taught more than just Carol today," she said softly. "You've taught all of us something about dignity and justice. Thank you for that." Amara's heels clicked against the airport terminal floor as she walked toward the exit, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. The weight of her briefcase felt different now, as if the legal documents inside had taken on new meaning after today's events. Her phone buzzed with a message from her clerk about tomorrow's hearings. The ordinary reminder of her professional life felt almost jarring after what had just transpired. How strange that while she'd been dealing with discrimination at 300 feet, the machinery of justice had kept running smoothly on the ground. She paused at a large window overlooking the runway, watching planes take off and land in the darkness. Somewhere out there, Carol was probably starting her journey home, carrying the weight of their encounter with her. Amara hoped it would lead to real change, not just in Carol's behavior, but in her understanding of the world. The young woman from the flight, who had introduced herself as Maya before leaving, had promised to send the video to Amara's office, not as evidence for punishment, but as a potential teaching tool. "People need to see how these things happen," she'd said, "how they build up from small moments into something bigger." Amara thought about all the time she'd ruled on discrimination cases from the bench. How often had she heard lawyers argue about intent and impact, trying to quantify harm in legal terms? But today's experience had reminded her that the real damage often came from the accumulation of small cuts, the looks, the assumptions, the quiet dismissals that wore away at someone's sense of belonging. A group of flight attendants walked past, their uniforms crisp and professional. Amara found herself wondering about their stories, their experiences. How many of them had witnessed situations like today's? How many had stayed silent, unsure how to intervene? Her reflection in the window caught her eye. The water stain on her dress had dried completely now, barely visible unless you knew where to look. Like so many marks left by prejudice, it would fade from sight but leave its impression on memory. Outside, the airport's night air felt fresh against her face. Her driver was waiting, ready to take her home, But Amara took a moment to breathe in the freedom of open space after hours in the confined cabin. The elderly woman's words echoed in her mind. "You've taught all of us something about dignity and justice." That hadn't been her intention when she boarded the flight, but perhaps these unplanned lessons were sometimes the most powerful. Amara had helped shape laws that protected people's rights, had written opinions that would guide future generations of judges, but today's experience reminded her that justice wasn't just found in courtrooms and legal documents. It lived in everyday moments, in small stands against prejudice, in the courage to speak up when silence would be easier. Tomorrow she would return to her chambers, don her robes, and resume her role in the formal justice system. But she would carry this experience with her, let it inform her understanding of the cases that came before her. Sometimes the most important perspective wasn't found in legal precedent, but in lived experience. The driver opened the car door, and Amara slid into the familiar leather seat. As they pulled away from the airport, she watched the planes continuing their endless cycle of takeoff and landing. Somewhere up there, other battles were probably being fought, other assumptions being challenged, other lessons being learned. She pulled out her phone and began typing notes for her next speaking engagement at a law school. She had a new story to share now, a personal testament to the way justice and injustice could appear in the most unexpected places. Maybe her experience would help future lawyers understand that their role wasn't just to argue cases, but to recognize and challenge prejudice in all its forms. The city lights blurred past her window as they drove, each one a reminder of the countless lives intersecting in ways both meaningful and mundane. She thought about Carol, about Maya, about the elderly woman and the businessman. How a few hours on a plane had connected their stories and, maybe, just maybe, changed their perspectives. Her hands found the familiar comfort of her briefcase, filled with the tools of her profession, law books, case files, legal pads. But today had reminded her that sometimes the most powerful tool for justice was simply the courage to be herself, to stand her ground with dignity, and to turn moments of prejudice into opportunities for growth. As her house came into view, Amara felt a renewed sense of purpose. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, new opportunities to shape the law. But today had taught her something no law book could. That justice wasn't just a concept to be debated in court, but a living, breathing thing that had to be nurtured in every interaction, every moment, every choice to stand up or stay silent. She was more than just a Supreme Court justice now. She was a witness to the ongoing struggle for dignity and respect, a participant in the daily work of building a more just world. And somehow, that felt like the most important title she'd ever held.